I didn't know donating blood that night would tie my life to a man I was never supposed to meet. The rain started just after 9 p.m., the kind that blurred streetlights into glowing halos and turned every delivery into a gamble. And I remember thinking my car wouldn't survive another shift like this, not with the check engine light blinking like a warning I couldn't afford to listen to. But rent was due in 3 days, and my mom's medical bill sat folded in my pocket like a quiet threat. So I kept driving. One order after another, cold fries, soggy burgers, people who never looked at my face. When they opened the door, just my hands, just the bag, just the transaction, until the last delivery sent me 3 blocks off my usual route, down a narrow street I'd never noticed before, where the buildings leaned too close and the streetlights flickered like they were tired of trying. And that's when I saw him, or more like I almost didn't, because he was slumped near the curb, half hidden in shadow, a dark coat soaked through, one hand pressed against his side like he was holding himself together, and I froze, engine still running, rain tapping against the windshield in uneven rhythms, because nothing about that scene felt normal, not the stillness, not the silence, not the way the world seemed to pause around him. And for a second, just 1 second, I thought about driving away, about pretending I hadn't seen anything, because people like me don't get involved in things like that. We deliver, we survive, we mind our business. But then his hand slipped, just slightly, and I saw the movement, weak, barely there, but enough to make my chest tighten, enough to make me open the door and step out into the rain, my sneakers soaking instantly as I moved closer, every instinct telling me this was a mistake, that I was stepping into something I wouldn't understand. But I knelt anyway, my voice coming out softer than I expected, asking if he could hear me, if he was okay. And his eyes opened just a fraction, dark, unfocused, but aware, and I swear in that moment it felt like he was looking straight through me, like he was measuring something I couldn't see. And then everything sped up, flashing lights, sirens cutting through the rain, voices talking over each other, paramedics moving with practiced urgency while I stood there useless, hands shaking, until someone turned to me and asked my blood type, and I answered without thinking, like it was just another question, just another part of the night, until they told me they needed me, because there wasn't time, because he might not make it without it. And I remember sitting in that cold hospital chair, sleeve rolled up, watching the red line fill slowly. Steady, real, part of me leaving my body and going somewhere I couldn't follow, and I told myself it didn't matter, that he was just a stranger, that this was what you do when someone needs help. You help, no questions, no expectations, just the right thing. But when it was over, when they wheeled him past me into a room guarded by silence, and something heavier I couldn't name, I felt it, something shift, something settled deep in my chest, like a line had been crossed without my permission, and I tried to ignore it, tried to stand, to leave, to go back to my car and finish the night like nothing had changed. But as I reached the door, I heard a voice behind me, low, steady, unmistakably controlled, and even before I turned, I knew somehow that he was awake, that he was looking at me again, and that whatever had just happened between us wasn't over. I should have left before he opened his eyes, but my body did not listen to me. It stayed there like it was waiting for something I could not explain, my hand still pressed against the bandage on my arm where they had taken my blood, the spot warm and strange, like a reminder that something of me was no longer mine. And then I turned, slowly, because you can feel it when someone powerful is looking at you, even if you have never met them before, even if you do not understand why your heartbeat suddenly sounds too loud in your ears. And there he was, sitting up in the hospital bed like he had not just been carried in half-conscious less than an hour ago, dark hair still damp, expression unreadable, but his eyes clear now, sharp in a way that made the room feel smaller, and everything else around him felt quieter. Like the machines, the nurses, even the rain outside had decided to lower their volume without being asked, and he did not say thank you. Not the way normal people do, not the way I expected. Instead, his gaze moved from my face to my arm, to the small white bandage, and then back to me. And when he spoke, his voice was low, steady, controlled in a way that made it impossible to ignore. He asked why. Just one word. Why? And I blinked because it felt like the wrong question, like he was asking something deeper than what had just happened, and I told him the truth, or at least the version of the truth that made sense to me. I said that he needed help, that no one else was there, that it was not a big deal, but the way he watched me made it feel like every word I said was being weighed, measured, remembered, and then his hand moved, slow, deliberate, reaching toward mine, not grabbing, not forcing, just enough to stop me from stepping back, and his fingers were warm, steady, nothing, like the chaos of the night outside, and he looked at me again, more intensely this time, and said something that did not sound like gratitude at all. He said, "You gave me your blood," like it meant more than just survival, like it meant ownership, like it meant connection. And something about the way he said it made a chill move through me that had nothing to do with the cold rain still clinging to my clothes. And I pulled my hand back, gently but firmly, because whatever this was, it was already too much, too strange. And I told him again that it was nothing, that I was just doing the right thing. But he did not look convinced. He looked certain, certain in a way that made me uncomfortable. And before I could say anything else, the door opened, and suddenly the room filled with men in dark suits who moved like they belonged there more than anyone else, their presence quiet but heavy. And every nurse who had been nearby seemed to step back without being told, like they understood something I did not. And one of the men spoke to him in a low voice, respectful, controlled, calling him Mr. DeLuca, and that was the moment. Everything inside me shifted, because I had heard that name before, not in conversations like mine, but in whispers, in news stories people pretended not to pay attention to, in warnings that never said too much but always said enough. And I felt it then, the weight of what I had stepped into, the realization that the man I had helped was not just a stranger, not just someone who needed saving, but someone who lived in a world I had no place in. And I took a step back, then another, because suddenly staying felt dangerous in a way I could not explain. And as I reached the door, ready to leave, ready to forget, his voice stopped me again, calm, certain, like he already knew I would listen, and he said my name, not just Emily, but Emily Carter, and my breath caught because I had never told him that, not once, not anywhere, and I turned back slowly, fear mixing with something else I did not want to name, and he held my gaze like it was the only thing in the room that mattered, and said, almost quietly, "You are not just a stranger anymore." And in that moment, I understood something I should have realized sooner, that walking away was not going to be as simple as opening a door and stepping back into the rain. I did not remember leaving the hospital, only that somehow I was back in my car with the engine running and my hands gripping the steering wheel like it was the only thing keeping me grounded, the rain still falling in soft, steady lines across the windshield. And for a moment, I just sat there, breathing, trying to convince myself that nothing had changed, that I had done a good thing, and that was the end of it. But his voice stayed with me. The way he said my name like it already belonged to him, the way the room had shifted around him, and I shook my head like I could physically push the thought away. Because people like me do not get tangled in stories like that. We clock in, we deliver, we go home, and that is where it ends. Except it did not end, not even a little. Because the moment I pulled into the parking lot of my apartment building, something felt different, not wrong exactly, just unfamiliar, like walking into a place you have known your whole life and realizing someone moved the furniture while you were gone. And I noticed it first when I checked my phone. 3 missed calls from a number I did not recognize, no voicemail, just silence. And I told myself it was nothing, probably a customer, probably someone who tapped the wrong contact. But then I saw the notification from my bank, and my stomach dropped because the number on the screen did not make sense, not even close. The negative balance I had been trying not to think about was gone, replaced by a clean zero, like it had never existed, like the last 6 months of stress had been erased with one quiet decision. And I stared at it, refreshing the app again and again like it would correct itself, like reality would snap back into place, but it did not. And that is when the fear started to settle in, slow and heavy, because nothing in my life ever fixed itself without a cost, and I knew, deep down, that this was not luck, this was not coincidence, this was something else, something that had started the moment I sat in that hospital chair and watched my blood leave my body. And I got out of the car slowly, scanning the lot without meaning to, noticing things I had never paid attention to before, a black SUV parked near the far corner with its lights off, a man standing near the entrance pretending to be on his phone, but not moving, not really, and maybe it was nothing, maybe I was just tired, just imagining patterns where there were none. But my instincts did not agree. They whispered that I was being seen, that someone knew exactly where I was and what I was doing, and I hurried inside, locking my apartment door behind me faster than usual, leaning against it for a second like it could hold back whatever had followed me home. And my place looked the same worn couch, the same stack of unpaid bills on the table, the same quiet hum of the old refrigerator. But it did not feel the same. It felt like a space that had already been entered without me knowing, and I moved through it carefully, checking corners, checking windows, telling myself I was being ridiculous until my phone buzzed again in my hand. And this time I answered, because something told me ignoring it would not make it stop, and the line was silent for half a second before a familiar voice filled the space between us, calm, controlled, unmistakable. And he did not introduce himself. He did not need to. He just said you made it home safely, like it was a statement, not a question. And every part of me went still because I had not told him where I lived. Not once, not ever. And I swallowed, trying to find something normal to say, something that would put distance between us, but the words did not come. And he continued, his tone steady, almost thoughtful, like he was explaining something simple, something obvious. You should not worry about your debts anymore. And that was it. No explanation, no request, just a fact delivered like it had already been decided. And I closed my eyes, pressing my hand against the bandage on my arm again, feeling the faint ache beneath it. And for the first time that night, I understood that this was not about kindness. This was not about gratitude. This was something else entirely, something deeper, something binding. And when I finally found my voice, it came out quieter than I expected, almost like I was speaking to myself. I said I did not ask for this. And there was a pause on the other end, just long enough to make my heart race, before he answered, softly but with a certainty that left no room for argument. You did not have to ask, Emily. You already gave me something far more valuable. And the line went dead, leaving me standing there in the silence of my small apartment, staring at nothing, realizing that whatever had started in that hospital was not over. It was only just beginning. I did not sleep that night. Not really. I lay on my bed staring at the ceiling while the faint hum of the city filtered through the thin walls of my apartment, every small sound sharper than usual, every passing car making my chest tighten like it meant something, like it was coming for me. And I kept replaying his voice in my head, the calm certainty, the way he spoke like decisions had already been made without me. And at some point I realized something that made my stomach twist. This was not fear the way I had felt it before, not like when bills piled up or when my car made a strange noise. This was different. This was the feeling of being pulled into something bigger than me, something I could not control. And when my alarm went off at 6 in the morning, I turned it off without thinking and just sat there, exhausted but wired, knowing I still had to go to work because normal life does not pause just because something strange happens. It keeps moving. It expects you to keep up. So I got dressed, pulled on my delivery jacket, and told myself I would act like nothing had changed, that I would ignore the bank notification, ignore the call, ignore the way my name sounded in his voice. But the moment I stepped outside, that illusion cracked, because the black SUV from last night was still there, parked across the street now, not hidden anymore, not pretending, just there, like it belonged, like it had always been part of my routine. And I froze on the sidewalk, keys in my hand, debating whether to turn around and go back inside. But before I could decide, the driver's side door opened and a man stepped out, dressed in a dark suit that looked too precise for this neighborhood, his posture straight, his movements controlled, and he did not rush, did not hesitate. He just walked toward me like this was expected, like I was expected. And when he stopped a few feet away, he gave a small nod, respectful but distant, and said my name, Miss Carter, like it was a title, like it carried weight now. And I swallowed, trying to keep my voice steady as I asked what he wanted, even though I already knew, even though the answer had been clear since the moment I saw the car. And he did not waste time. He simply said that Mr. DeLuca had arranged transportation for me, that I would not be driving myself anymore. And the way he said it was not a suggestion, not an offer. It was a statement, a change already in effect. And I shook my head immediately, stepping back, telling him no, that I had work, that I had my own car, my own life. But he did not react, did not argue, just listened with the same calm expression, and then said something that made my words catch in my throat. He said, your route has been updated. All your deliveries for today have already been reassigned. And I blinked because that was impossible, because no one had access to that except me and the app on my phone. But when I checked, my screen confirmed it. Every single order gone, replaced with a blank schedule, like I had never logged in at all. And I looked back at him, confusion mixing with something sharper, something closer to anger, asking how that happened. And he met my gaze without hesitation and answered simply, "Because Mr. DeLuca prefers you safe." And the word safe echoed in my mind like it did not belong there, like it meant something different coming from him. And I let out a breath I did not realize I was holding, my grip tightening on my keys as I tried to hold on to something normal, something mine, but it was slipping piece by piece. And I realized then that this was how it started, not with force, not with threats, but with quiet changes, subtle shifts that left no room for refusal. And I looked past him at the open car door, at the dark interior waiting like an answer I did not want. And for a moment I considered walking away, just turning and leaving, pretending I could outrun whatever this was. But deep down I already knew the truth. This was not something you walked away from. This was something that followed you, that found you, that adjusted the world around you until there was nowhere left to go. And when I finally moved, it was not forward or backward, just a small step, hesitant, uncertain, as I realized that the life I had yesterday was already gone, replaced by something I did not choose but could no longer ignore. I did not remember deciding to get into the car, only that somehow I was sitting inside it with the door closing softly behind me. The outside world instantly muted, like the rain and the noise and everything familiar had been sealed off in a single quiet motion, and the interior smelled faintly of leather and something clean, controlled, nothing like my car with its old coffee cups and worn seats. And I sat there for a second, hands in my lap, trying to understand how I had crossed that line so easily, how I had gone from standing on the sidewalk to being inside something that clearly did not belong to my world. And the man who had spoken to me earlier did not look back. He simply closed the door, walked around to the driver's side, and started the engine like this was routine, like I was already part of whatever system this was. And I finally found my voice, asking where we were going, even though part of me already knew the answer would not be something I could refuse. And he replied calmly, saying I had been invited to have breakfast, like this was normal, like people like me got invited into mornings like that. And I almost laughed because it sounded absurd, because I had never been invited anywhere that did not involve a time slot and a delivery address. But the words did not come out, because something about this did not feel like an invitation at all. It felt like a step in a process I had already entered. And the city moved past the tinted windows as we drove. Streets I recognized slowly giving way to neighborhoods I did not. Buildings getting taller, cleaner, quieter, until the noise of my usual routes disappeared completely, replaced by something slower, more deliberate. And I watched it all in silence, my reflection faint in the glass, looking like someone who had taken a wrong turn and kept going. And when the car finally slowed, it was in front of a building that did not need a sign, the kind of place you just knew was important, the kind of place where people did not ask questions, and the doors opened before the car even fully stopped. Two men standing there like they had been waiting, and I felt it again, that shift in the air, that invisible line that separated this world from mine. And when the driver stepped out and opened my door, I hesitated, just for a second, because stepping out meant accepting something I did not understand. But staying inside was not really an option either. And when my feet touched the ground, everything felt too still, too quiet, like the building itself was watching, and I followed them inside, my steps slower than theirs, my eyes taking in details I had never paid attention to before, marble floors that reflected the light like mirrors, high ceilings that made every sound echo just enough to remind you where you were, and people who moved without rushing, without noise, like everything here had a purpose and nothing was accidental. And I became aware of how out of place I looked, my delivery jacket, my worn sneakers, the faint crease in my jeans from too many long shifts, and I almost stopped walking, almost turned around, because this was not my life. This was not supposed to be my story, but they kept moving and somehow I kept following, like my body had already accepted what my mind was still trying to deny. And when we reached the elevator, one of the men pressed a button without looking at me, and the doors opened instantly, like they had been waiting too. And as we stepped inside, I caught my reflection again in the polished metal walls, and for a moment I did not recognize the girl staring back, because she looked like someone standing at the edge of something irreversible, and the ride up was silent. No music, no conversation, just the soft hum of movement and the steady rise that made my stomach tighten slightly. And when the doors finally opened, the space in front of me was even quieter, more controlled, like the entire floor belonged to one person. And I knew before anyone said anything that he was here, that this was where he lived, where he ruled, where decisions like the ones affecting my life were made without hesitation, and my heart started to beat faster, not from running, not from fear exactly, but from something heavier, something that felt like stepping into a place where I did not get to decide what happened next. And as I took a step forward, I heard his voice before I saw him, calm, certain, like he had been expecting me the entire time, and he said, "You came," not as a question, but as confirmation, and I realized then that this was never about whether I would come or not. It was about when I would understand that I already had. For a second I could not move, because hearing his voice here, in a place that felt so controlled and untouchable, made everything from the night before real in a way I could not ignore anymore. And I stepped forward slowly, my eyes adjusting to the space as I finally saw him, standing near a long table set with breakfast that looked untouched, sunlight cutting through the tall windows behind him and outlining his figure like something deliberate, something placed exactly where it was meant to be. And he looked different now, not weaker, not like someone who had needed saving just hours ago, but composed, dressed in a dark shirt with the sleeves rolled just enough to show that same steady control in the way he held himself, like whatever had happened before had not broken him. It had only paused him, and his eyes found mine immediately, not surprised, not curious, just certain, like this moment had already existed before I walked in. And I stopped a few feet away, aware of the distance, aware of the silence stretching between us. And I spoke first because I needed something normal, something human, asking if he was okay. And even as the words left my mouth, they felt small, almost irrelevant in a place like this. And he tilted his head slightly, studying me in that same measured way, before answering that he was alive, like that was the only detail that mattered. And I nodded, unsure what to say next. Because this was not how things were supposed to go. I was supposed to help, leave, forget, but instead I was here, standing in a world that had already started reshaping mine, and he gestured toward the table then, inviting me to sit. And I hesitated because sitting felt like staying, and staying felt like accepting something I had not agreed to. But the quiet expectation in the room made refusal feel out of place, so I moved forward and sat across from him, my posture stiff, my hands resting lightly on my lap like I was trying not to touch anything that did not belong to me. And for a moment neither of us spoke, the only sound the faint clink of silverware as he poured coffee into a cup and slid it toward me without asking, like he already knew I would need it. And I stared at it before looking back at him, asking why I was here, because that was the question that had been building since the moment I saw the car outside my apartment. And he did not answer right away. Instead he watched me again, like he was deciding how much to say, how much I was ready to understand. And then he spoke, calm and precise, saying that actions create consequences, that choices connect people whether they intend to or not. And I felt a flicker of frustration rise in my chest because that was not an answer, not really. So I leaned forward slightly, my voice firmer this time as I told him I did not agree to any of this, that I helped him because it was the right thing to do, not because I wanted something in return. And his expression did not change, but something in his eyes shifted, something quieter, more focused, and he set his cup down carefully before speaking again, saying that I was still thinking in terms of before, like there was a line I could step back across. And that was when I realized the difference between us, because to me, that night was a moment, something that happened and should end. But to him, it was the beginning of something that could not be undone. And I shook my head slightly, trying to hold on to my version of reality, telling him that I wanted my life back, my job, my routine, my space. And he listened, actually listened, without interrupting, without dismissing me, which somehow made it harder, because it felt like he understood and still chose not to change anything. And when I finished, the silence returned for a second, heavy but not hostile, before he leaned back slightly and said something that made my breath catch. He said, "You still have your life, Emily. It just includes me now, and the simplicity of it, the certainty, The way he said it like it was already true made something inside me shift again, because I could argue, I could refuse, I could say no. But deep down I was starting to understand that none of those things would change the fact that he had already stepped into my world, and he was not planning to leave. I stared at him, trying to find something in his expression that looked uncertain, something that suggested this was negotiable, but there was nothing, just that same calm control, like he was not forcing anything, and yet everything was already decided, and I felt it then, that shift again, the realization that arguing with him was like pushing against something that did not move, not because it resisted, but because it did not need to, and I leaned back slightly, my fingers curling together in my lap as I tried to steady myself. Because this was not just about him anymore. It was about what I was losing, what had already started slipping away without my permission, and I told him that this was not how things worked, that people did not just enter someone else's life and rearrange it like it was theirs, that I had responsibilities, that I had choices, and for a moment I thought I saw something flicker in his gaze, not anger, not frustration, but something quieter, like interest, like I had said something worth hearing, and he nodded once, slowly, like he was acknowledging my words rather than dismissing them. And then he asked me a question that caught me off guard. He asked what I thought would have happened if I had not stopped that night, and I opened my mouth to answer, to say something simple, something obvious, but the words did not come, because the truth was I had not thought about it that way. I had only seen a moment, a person who needed help, not the outcome, not the consequences, and he watched me closely, like he could see that realization forming in real time. And then he spoke again, his voice steady, almost quiet, saying that the world I lived in allowed me to believe that actions ended when I walked away, but his world did not work like that. In his world, everything connected, everything carried forward, and I felt a slow tension build in my chest because I did not want to understand him. I did not want to see things from his perspective, because that meant accepting something I was not ready to accept, and I shook my head again, more firmly this time, telling him that none of that gave him the right to control what happened to me, and he did not argue, did not raise his voice, did not try to convince me. He just stood up, the movement smooth, unhurried, and walked a few steps toward the window, looking out over the city like it belonged to him, like everything below was something he understood in a way I never could. And when he spoke again, he did not turn around. He simply said that control was not the point, that protection was, and the word landed differently this time, heavier, more intentional, and I frowned slightly, because it still did not make sense, not in a way that felt right. And I asked him who I needed protection from, because I had lived my whole life without this, without him, without whatever world he was part of. And for the first time, he paused, just for a second, like he was considering how much to reveal, and then he turned back to me, his expression unchanged but his gaze sharper, more focused, and he said that I had already been seen, that the moment I stepped into that alley, the moment I stayed, I had entered a space that people did not simply walk out of unnoticed, and my stomach tightened at that, because it confirmed something I had been trying not to think about, something that had been sitting quietly in the back of my mind since I saw the SUV outside my apartment, and I asked him what that meant, even though I was not sure I wanted the answer, and he stepped closer this time, not invading my space, but close enough that I could feel the shift in the air again, that quiet pressure that came with him, and he said it meant that I was no longer invisible, that people who should never have known I existed now did. And that was when the fear returned, not sharp, not immediate, but slow and real, settling into place as I realized this was not just about him choosing to be in my life. It was about something else choosing to notice me because of him. And I swallowed, my voice quieter now as I asked what I was supposed to do. And he looked at me like the answer was obvious, like it had been obvious from the start. And he said, "You stay where I can keep you safe." And I felt the weight of that settle over everything else, because for the first time, it did not sound like a choice at all. I shook my head before I even realized I was doing it, because something in me refused to accept that answer, refused to accept that staying here, in his world, was somehow the only option left. And I stood up too quickly, the chair scraping softly against the floor as I took a step back, putting distance between us like it might give me back some control. And I told him no, that I was not going to stay, that I could not just disappear from my life because of something I did out of basic human decency. And for a second the room felt smaller, not because he moved, But because he did not, because he stayed exactly where he was, watching me with that same steady gaze that never seemed rushed, never seemed uncertain, and it made my resistance feel louder than it actually was, like I was the only one reacting while he already knew how this would go. And I turned toward the door, my heart beating faster now, not from fear, but from determination, because leaving felt like the only thing I could still choose. And I took one step, then another, expecting something to stop me, a command, a hand, a voice raised just enough to force me back. But nothing came, no one moved, and that almost made it worse, because it felt like I was being allowed to leave, like this was part of something I did not understand. And I reached the elevator, pressing the button harder than necessary, my breath uneven as I waited, the silence behind me stretching longer than it should have. And when the doors opened, I stepped inside immediately, turning to face forward, refusing to look back because I did not want to see him standing there, did not want to see that calm expression that made everything feel inevitable. And the door slid shut, cutting him out of view. And for a moment I let out a breath, my shoulders dropping slightly like I had escaped something, like I had proven that I still had a choice. And the elevator began to descend, slow and steady, the numbers changing one by one as I watched them, grounding myself in something simple, something normal, until my phone buzzed in my hand. And I almost ignored it, almost let it ring because I already knew who it would be. But something made me look, and the message was short, just one line. No name, no explanation. You can leave the building, Emily, but not the situation. And my fingers tightened around the phone because it sounded exactly like him, like something he would say without needing to say more. And I stared at it for a second before shaking my head, telling myself it did not matter, that I was still leaving, still going back to my apartment, my car, my life. And when the elevator reached the lobby, the doors opened onto the same quiet space I had walked through earlier. But it felt different now, like I was seeing it from the outside again, like I was stepping out of something instead of into it. And I moved quickly, my steps faster this time, ignoring the way people glanced at me as I passed, ignoring the sense that I was being watched even without turning to check. And when I reached the entrance, the doors opened automatically, the cool air outside hitting my face like a reminder that the world was still there, still mine. And I stepped out onto the sidewalk, my heart still racing but something in me settling, like I had made a decision, like I had chosen my own path. And I walked, not looking back, not slowing down, just putting distance between me and that building, between me and him, until I reached the corner and turned, blending into the movement of the city like I always had, like I could just disappear back into it. But as I crossed the street, my phone buzzed again, and this time I hesitated before looking, because something told me it would not be the same. And when I read the message, my steps faltered just slightly, because it was not from him, not directly, but it carried the same weight, the same quiet certainty. Your route has changed again. And I looked up instinctively, scanning the street around me, noticing things I had not before, a car idling across the intersection, a figure standing too still near a storefront. And the realization settled in slowly, heavier than anything he had said inside that building. Because this was not about staying or leaving anymore. It was about understanding that wherever I went, whatever I chose, I was already part of something that moved with me. Something that had already adjusted the world around me without asking. And for the first time since I walked away, I was not sure if leaving had actually changed anything at all. I kept walking even after I realized I was no longer walking normally, my steps just a little faster, my breathing just a little too shallow, like my body had already understood something my mind was still trying to deny. Because once you start noticing, you cannot stop. And now I noticed everything. The reflection in store windows that showed more than just me. The same dark car turning the corner a few seconds after I did. The way a man across the street lowered his phone the moment I looked in his direction, and none of it was obvious enough to prove anything. But all of it together felt like a pattern I could not unsee. And I told myself to stay calm, to act normal, to blend in like I always had, because attention was the last thing I needed right now. But the problem was I no longer felt invisible. I felt marked, like something about me had changed in a way the world could suddenly recognize. And I reached my apartment building faster than usual, my keys already in my hand. Before I even hit the door, unlocking it quickly and stepping inside, the familiar hallway wrapping around me like a thin layer of safety that I did not fully trust anymore. And I moved up the stairs instead of taking the elevator, listening to every sound, every footstep, until I reached my door and slipped inside, locking it behind me with more force than necessary. And for a moment, I just stood there again, back against the door, breathing, trying to reset, trying to convince myself that this was still my space, that whatever was happening outside had not followed me in. But the silence felt different now, heavier, like it was waiting, and I pushed myself away from the door, moving through the apartment, checking the windows, the corners, the same routine I had done the night before, except this time it did not feel like paranoia. It felt like preparation, and my phone buzzed again in my hand, and I almost did not look, almost refused to give it that power, but I did, and the message was different this time, not from him, not from the unknown number, but from my delivery app. A notification that should have been ordinary, except the words made my stomach tighten. Account temporarily suspended, and I stared at it, refreshing it once, twice, like it might correct itself, but it did not, and I felt that quiet panic start to rise again, because that was my job, my income, the one thing that had always been mine no matter how unstable everything else felt, and now even that was gone, just like that, without warning, without explanation, and I sank down onto the edge of the couch, my mind racing, trying to figure out what to do next, what options I had left, and every path I tried to follow led back to the same place, the same name, the same man who had looked at me like my life was already part of his, and I pressed my fingers against my temples, closing my eyes for a second, because I did not want that to be true. I did not want him to be the answer to everything suddenly changing around me. But the more I thought about it, the clearer it became. This was not random. This was not bad luck. This was control, quiet and precise, shaping my world without ever raising a voice. And my phone buzzed again, and this time I did not hesitate. I opened it immediately, and the message was simple, almost gentle in its wording. You are making this harder than it needs to be. And I let out a breath that sounded more like a laugh than anything else, because of course it was him. Of course he knew. Of course he was watching this unfold like it was part of something already planned, and I typed back before I could stop myself, my fingers moving faster than my thoughts, telling him to stop, telling him to leave my life alone, telling him I did not want any of this. And the response came almost instantly, like he had been waiting, like there had never been a gap between my message and his words were calm, steady, unchanged. I am not taking anything from you, Emily. I am removing what puts you at risk, and I stared at that for a long second. Because it sounded reasonable, it sounded almost protective, but underneath it, I could feel the truth, that this was not about what I wanted, it was about what he had already decided. And I looked around my small apartment, at the life I had built piece by piece, imperfect but mine, and for the first time, I felt something shift inside me, not just fear, not just confusion, but something sharper, something that refused to disappear quietly. And I realized that if he thought I would simply accept this, simply adjust to the version of my life he was creating, then he did not understand me as well as he thought he did. And that realization settled into place slowly, steadying me in a way nothing else had. Because for the first time since this started, I was not just reacting, I was thinking about what came next. I stood up slowly from the couch, my phone still in my hand, the message glowing on the screen like a quiet challenge. And for the first time since all of this started, I did not feel cornered, I felt focused, because if he could reshape my life without asking, then I needed to understand how, where the lines were, what was real, and what was being controlled without me seeing it. And I moved to the small table near the window, grabbing my laptop, opening it with a kind of urgency that felt new, like I was finally stepping into something instead of being pulled through it. And I started with the simplest thing, his name, Luca DeLuca, typing it into the search bar even though part of me already knew what I would find. And the results came up instantly. Articles, business fronts, rumors wrapped in careful language, mentions of influence, of networks, of power that never quite explained itself, but always suggested something larger underneath. And I read through them, one after another, piecing together fragments, noticing patterns, the way certain words repeated without saying anything directly. And the more I read, the clearer it became that he was not just a man with resources. He was a system, something built over time, something that did not react. It anticipated, and I leaned back slightly, exhaling slowly as I tried to process what that meant for me. Because if he was that kind of presence, then everything happening around me was not random at all. It was intentional, precise, and that thought should have made me panic, but instead it made something inside me sharpen. Because systems had limits, they had structure, and structure meant there were ways to see them, to understand them, and I picked up my phone again, opening my banking app, my delivery app, checking everything I could think of, looking for changes, for patterns, for anything that showed how far this control reached, and it was everywhere in small ways. Quiet adjustments that would have gone unnoticed if I had not been looking for them. And I pressed my lips together, thinking, because if he could take things away, then he could give them back, which meant there was a choice, not mine, but his. And that realization settled heavily, because it meant I was not dealing with chaos. I was dealing with intention, and intention could be challenged, at least in some way. And I stood up again, moving to the window, pulling the curtain aside just slightly to look down at the street below, and the same car was still there, parked like it belonged, like it had always been part of the view. And I watched it for a second, not hiding, not stepping back, just observing. Because this time I wanted to see what happened when I did not act like I was being watched, and nothing changed. The car stayed still, the street moved around it, normal and quiet. But the difference was inside me, because I was no longer pretending it was not there, I was acknowledging it. And that gave me something small but important, a sense of awareness that had been missing before, and my phone buzzed again, and I did not rush to answer it this time. I let it sit for a second, like I was deciding whether he deserved my attention, before finally opening it. And the message was just one line again. You were trying to understand, and I almost smiled, just slightly, because of course he knew, of course he was paying attention to everything I did, and I typed back slowly this time, choosing my words carefully, telling him that understanding was the only way I was going to deal with this, that I was not going to be moved around without knowing why. And there was a pause, longer than before, just enough to make me wonder if I had pushed too far, before his response came through, and it was different. This time, not dismissive, not controlling, just direct. Then come back and ask me in person, and I stared at the message, my reflection faint in the screen, because this was not a demand, not exactly. It was something else, something closer to an invitation, but one that carried weight. One that meant stepping back into his world on my own terms. And I lowered the phone slowly, my gaze drifting back to the car outside, to the quiet street, to the life that was no longer as simple as it had been 2 days ago. And I realized that standing here, trying to figure everything out from a distance, was not going to change anything. Because whatever this was, it had already reached me, already reshaped things I thought were stable. And if I wanted any control at all, I would have to step into it, not run from it. And that thought settled into place, steady and unavoidable, as I finally understood that the next move was mine. But it would take me right back to him. I did not take long to decide, not because I trusted him, but because I trusted the fact that doing nothing was no longer an option. And I grabbed my jacket again, my keys, my phone, moving with a kind of clarity that had not been there before, because this time I was not being pulled, I was choosing to go. Even if that choice led me right back into the center of everything I did not understand. And when I stepped outside, the air felt different, not colder, not warmer, just sharper, like my senses had adjusted overnight. And the car was still there, exactly where I had seen it before. And for the first time, I did not hesitate. I walked straight toward it, my steps steady, my gaze forward, and the man inside noticed immediately, stepping out before I even reached the curb, opening the door without a word. Without surprise, like he had known this moment would come. And I paused just briefly, not out of fear, but out of awareness, because this was the point where I was stepping back in, and I needed to remember that I was doing it on purpose. And then I got in, the door closing behind me with that same quiet finality. And as the car pulled away, I watched my building disappear through the window, smaller and smaller until it was just another part of the city I had always known. And I wondered, just for a second, if I would ever see it the same way again. And the ride was quieter this time, not because nothing was happening, but because I was thinking, replaying everything from the last 2 days, trying to piece together what I was walking into, what I needed to ask, what I needed to understand. And when we arrived at the building again, it did not feel as unfamiliar as before, which was its own kind of realization. because it meant I had already started to adjust, already started to recognize this place as part of my reality, and I stepped out without waiting this time, moving through the entrance with less hesitation, noticing the same details but reacting differently, less like a stranger and more like someone who knew where they were going, even if they did not fully understand why. And when I reached the elevator, it opened immediately again, like the building itself was responding to me, and I stepped inside, watching my reflection in the mirrored walls. And this time I recognized the girl looking back, not because she looked the same, but because she looked more certain, more aware of the fact that she was no longer just reacting to what was happening around her. And when the doors opened, the same quiet floor greeted me, the same controlled silence. And I walked forward without being guided, following the memory of where he had been before, and I found him in the same place, near the window, like he had not moved, like time here worked differently. And he turned as I approached, his gaze settling on me with that same calm recognition. And there was something almost subtle in the way he looked at me now, like he had expected this, like he had known I would come back not because I had no choice, but because I needed answers. And I stopped a few feet away, holding his gaze this time without looking away, because that felt important, like it was the first thing I could control in this space. And I spoke before he could, my voice steady in a way that surprised even me, telling him that I was here because I wanted the truth, not pieces, not explanations that avoided the real answer, but everything. And the room stayed quiet for a second, the kind of silence that felt deliberate, like it was making space for something important. And he studied me again, but this time it felt different, less like he was measuring me and more like he was acknowledging something I had stepped into. And then he nodded once, slow and certain, and said something that made my chest tighten slightly, not from fear, but from the weight of what it meant. He said, "Once you understand, Emily, you do not get to go back to not knowing." And I held his gaze, not stepping back, not looking away, because I had already crossed that line the moment I walked in, and I said, "I know," even if I was not entirely sure what that would cost me. And for the first time since all of this started, it felt like the next moment was not just his decision, it was ours. He did not speak immediately, and somehow that made everything feel heavier, like whatever he was about to say carried more weight than anything before it. And he moved away from the window slowly, not rushing, not hesitating, just deliberate, until he stood closer to me, close enough that I could feel that same shift in the air, that quiet pressure that came with him. And when he spoke, his voice was calm but different this time, less distant, more direct, like he was no longer deciding what I could handle. He was simply telling me the truth, and he said that the man I found that night had not been alone, that there had been others watching, others waiting, and that when I stepped into that moment, when I chose to stay instead of leaving, I had been seen, not just by him, but by people who did not forget faces, who did not ignore witnesses. And I felt my chest tighten at that, because it confirmed what I had already started to understand, that this was never just about one decision. It was about the consequences that followed it. And I asked him why they had not come for me yet, because if what he was saying was true, then I should have already felt something more than just being watched. And he held my gaze steadily, as he answered, saying that they had, just not in a way I would recognize, that the changes around me, the pressure, the shifts, were not only his doing, but a response, a test, a way of seeing how exposed I was, how easy I would be to reach. And I felt a chill move through me at that, because it meant I had been part of something without even realizing it, that every step I took had already been observed, measured. And I shook my head slightly, trying to process it, trying to find something solid in the middle of it. And I asked him why he was involved, why he was the one stepping in, and his answer came without hesitation, like it was the simplest part of everything. He said, "Because you are connected to me now." And the way he said it was not possessive, not forceful, just factual, like it was something that existed whether I accepted it or not. And I looked at him, searching for something more, some explanation that made it less absolute. But there was none, and he continued, saying that in his world, connections were not ignored. They were protected or they were used, and he had made a choice. And I realized then that this was not just about keeping me safe. It was about what I represented now, a point of contact, a vulnerability, something that could be turned into leverage if it was left unguarded. And the thought made my stomach tighten again, because I had never been important enough to matter like that, never been in a position where my existence could affect anything beyond my own life. And now suddenly I was part of something that reached far beyond me. And I asked him what would happen if I walked away from all of this, if I refused to be part of it at all. And for the first time, there was a slight pause in his expression, not uncertainty, but consideration. And then he answered honestly, saying that I would be alone in a situation I did not understand, exposed to people who would not hesitate to use me if they found a reason to, and that he would not be able to guarantee anything beyond that. And the way he said it made it clear that this was not a threat, it was a reality, one he was not trying to soften. And I looked down for a second, my thoughts moving quickly, because this was the part where everything became real, not just strange, not just overwhelming, but real in a way that required a decision. And when I looked back up at him, something inside me had shifted again, not into fear, but into something steadier, something that understood the weight of what I was choosing. And I asked him one last question, my voice quieter now but firm, asking what staying would actually mean, not in vague terms, not in implications, but in reality. And he held my gaze for a moment before answering. And his words were simple, but they settled into place with a clarity that left no room for misunderstanding. He said it means you are under my protection, completely, and for the first time, I realized that protection, in his world, was not just safety, it was a position, a place within something much larger, and whether I wanted it or not, I was already standing at the edge of it. I did not answer him right away, not because I did not understand, but because I understood too clearly, and that made everything heavier, more final, and I stood there in the quiet space between us, feeling the weight of what he was offering, or maybe what he was stating, because it did not feel like something I could accept or reject in a simple way. It felt like something that already existed and was waiting for me to recognize it. And I let out a slow breath, my fingers brushing lightly over the faint mark on my arm where the needle had been, that small, almost invisible point where all of this had started. And I realized how strange it was that something so small could change everything. That one decision, one moment of choosing to stay instead of walking away, had led me here, standing in a place I never imagined, facing a man who spoke about protection like it was both a shield and a claim. And I lifted my gaze back to him, meeting his eyes fully this time, not searching, not questioning, just seeing him for what he was, someone who did not ask for control but carried it naturally, someone who did not raise his voice but still changed everything around him. And I asked him quietly what would happen next, not in terms of plans or details, but in terms of me, of my life, of the version of myself that existed before all of this. And he watched me for a second, like he understood what I was really asking. And then he said something that surprised me, something that did not sound like ownership or authority. He said that nothing I was would be taken from me, only what threatened me would be removed. And I felt something shift at that, something small but real, because for the first time, it did not sound like I was being replaced. It sounded like I was being repositioned, and that difference mattered more than I expected. And I thought about my apartment, my job, the quiet routine I had built out of necessity, not because it was perfect, but because it was mine. And I realized that holding on to that version of my life did not mean pretending this had not happened. It meant deciding how it would exist alongside it. And I took a step closer to him, not because I was drawn in, but because I was choosing to stand in this moment instead of outside it. And I told him that if I stayed, it would not be because I had no choice. It would be because I understood what I was stepping into, and his expression did not change, but something in his gaze settled, like that was the answer he had been waiting for. And he nodded once, slow and certain, and said that understanding was the only thing he required, and the simplicity of it felt almost disarming, because there were no conditions, no demands, just that. And I let out another breath, steadier this time, because the fear that had followed me since that night was no longer the only thing I felt. There was something else now, something that felt like standing at the edge of something unknown and deciding not to step back. And I glanced briefly toward the window, at the city stretching out below, the same streets I had driven through countless times now, looking different from this height, like perspective alone could change the meaning of everything. And when I looked back at him, I did not feel like I was losing my life. I felt like I was seeing it expand in a direction I had never expected. And I said yes, not loudly, not dramatically, just clearly enough that it did not need to be repeated, and the words settled into the space between us, quiet but permanent. and he held my gaze for a moment longer before speaking again, his voice as calm as it had always been, but carrying something new now, something that felt almost like acknowledgement. And he said, "Then you stay where you are protected," and I felt the meaning of that differently this time, not as a boundary, not as a limitation, but as a reality I had chosen to step into. And as I stood there, in a place that no longer felt entirely unfamiliar, I realized that I had not just saved a stranger that night. I had crossed into a world that would not let me remain the same, and for the first time, I was no longer trying to leave it behind.